Hi, so now we're going to make some Zwetschgendatschi dough. And if you've watched previous episodes, like the brioche episode, you'll have been familiarized with this type of enriched dough, which has milk and eggs and fat in it. Unlike the brioche dough, it doesn't have as much fat. So you can play with the temperature a little. Things can be room temperature and it won't split. And first of all, Zwetschgendatschi is plum cake. And when I grew up, we ate it when we went to Bavaria to my mom's home and my family. We would go to the pastry shop and get this kind, the yeasted version. But we also, when we were at home, we made a different version where it had more of a cookie crust, so which was a little faster, just as tasty. But this makes me think of my mother either way, whether it's yeasted or cookie-ish, it's all good. So the first thing I added to my mixing bowl was 150 milliliters of whole milk. Make sure it's whole milk. And to that I'm going to add my sugar, which is 50 grams. And to that, again, I'm going to add the zest of 1 lemon. That goes in there. And then my eggs will go in here as well. So it's 1 whole egg and 1 yolk. In you go. And I always add the wet ingredients first to any kind of residential home mixer because you know that that equipment doesn't actually touch the sides and the bottom. So if you leave that flour in first and then put in the liquids, it's going to be going like this. And then it's going to be looking lovely on top, but there's going to be this flour sitting in the bottom going, what? What's going on? It wants to be mixed in, and it's not. So make sure liquids in first. And very German thing, vanilla, but almond extract. My grandmother actually used something called arak, which is a Turkish liqueur that is used a lot in German baking, and it has an anise flavor, also very German. But I actually prefer the almond flavor in this. And before I add my dry ingredients, I'm going to whisk on up, just to break up the eggs, because I don't want the flour to hit this and then just to have these chunks of egg yolk hanging around and not incorporating. So I whisk first. I'm going to grab some salt over here. Ignore me. So adding salt to here. And then I'm going to mix up my flour, 3 cups or 360 grams. And then to the flour, I'm going to add my yeast. It's an instant yeast. This specifically is an osmotolerant yeast. That just means it was built to withstand doughs like this that have fat and sugar in them. Because if you just used a regular instant yeast, it will work, but it has to do a little more work, and it isn't as protected. So what you want to do, if you can find it, is that osmo yeast will work in tandem with the sugars and the fats a little more easily. It's a little more tolerant. Now I'm going to add my flour, and you'll notice maybe that over here I have my butter, and it's cold butter. You can use room temperature butter, but what I do is this is a European butter. You can use just your regular old American butter, but what I do when it's cold, I grate it so it's nice and fluffy, and it keeps that temperature nice and cool of the dough, which is kind of important with these kinds of high-fat doughs, but it incorporates more quickly than if you just added it in chunks, so it's nice and fluffy. That's how I like to do it. So this is my mom's mixer. I inherited it, and I love it so much. It's missing some components. It's like missing the little knob here. It is always on, so when I want to start mixing, I plug it in, and when I stop, I have to unplug it. But she had this since I don't know how long, since I can remember. And it has never broken down. So whenever I test recipes, when I'm baking for us at home, I always use this, and I think of my mom, and I know it's just a workhorse. It's going to work for everything. And so this is a dough that needs a little work, and I touch it every once in a while to make sure it's not getting too hot. And then if it is, I will stop it because this puppy, I don't want to break it. But it's pretty great. This one has gone through so many really tough doughs for me without a problem, knock on wood. So I'm going to start it up now on low. Let's make sure it's on low. There we go. Plugging it in. Come on, little guy. And watch it go. You'll tell me if it's going too fast, won't you? There we go. So I'm going to let this run until the dough comes together and starts producing some gluten structure. And I want to do that first before adding the butter. If I added the butter too soon, there would be too much fat in there impeding gluten development. Because what fat does with gluten, it does something lovely. It tenderizes it, because what it will do at the beginning is coat some of that flour in, I call them fat spanks. So butter is like spanks of baking, because what it will do to the gluten is that it coats that flour and it impedes gluten development because the moisture can't get in. So I hold it back so I can produce some gluten first so I don't have to be mixing so long. It's still a long mix, 10 to 15 minutes, but not that long compared to adding the butter right away. So want this to come together into a mass. I don't want to see any dry bits down here. It's going to look a little shaggy. That is okay. But I do want it to come together. Let's turn this off. Unplug. So let's take a look at this. You can see it's still very shaggy. Still very underdeveloped. As it is crawling up the hook, it's not developing any gluten here because it's just hanging on for the ride. So you want to make sure that every once in a while, when that starts happening, is to drag it down and put it back in the bowl. So still a little too shaggy before I add the butter, but it's getting there. Now it's cohesive. It's picked up, from what I can see, most of the dry stuff from the bottom. So let's mix this for like a minute more, and then we can start adding the butter. Once I add the butter, it's going to mix for about 10 to 15 minutes. And this is where people get these things wrong, that when they're making an enriched dough, they get tired of mixing it for so long. And what you'll see on the surface of the baked good, it looks ruddy, it doesn't look smooth. And it's also not as lofty and as tender as it should be. So this does make a difference, this mixing does. And I know it's frustrating because it takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of work, right? Your poor machine is like going, arr. So every once in a while, let it stop, feel it, make sure that it's cooled down. And as it starts developing more and more, it has more and more structure. That means it will also be less sticky. So if you want to start working it on the counter, that's a great time to do it. So you can let it mix in here for 5 to 7 minutes. Give your mixer a break and start mixing it by hand here. And the best way to do that is not to add a lot of extra flour, but to use a bowl scraper to scrape up the dough instead of having flour there to keep it from sticking. And that's the perfect way to mix on a surface. So let's look at this again. It's a little smoother, not completely smooth, but smooth enough, I think, at this point. Still, you see it's shaggy. Gonna grab that down. Let that fall into the mixer. Get in there, bud. And I'm gonna add my first plop of butter. And you can see why I like doing this so much, because I add this in 4 portions. And when I add it in, you can see how nice and aerated it already is. So when it starts incorporating, it does it rather quickly. And then I can just step back, set it, and forget it. A little faster. So that's my first addition of butter. Before I add my next one, I'm going to wait for it to disappear. And if it's riding the hook, which it is, look at it. You see that butter right there? You don't want that there, so I'm going to push it back in. Get in there. Ha-ha! Let's put our next little plop in there. I'm going to try to aim towards the bottom of the mixer so it doesn't ride up the hook again. And 1, 2, got it. Perfect. Got some here, get that down. And what you'll notice too is that as you start adding this fat and it starts getting incorporated, the dough starts to spread out a little bit. It gets a little more sticky. And to me, that's actually a good thing because it is a good visual indicator of the dough not being ready. Once the dough is ready, it will start picking up from the bottom and sides of the dough. It will look smoother and it will actually start making a noise like it's the thwap, thwap, thwap. I'll take that down, add another bulk of butter. I plugged this the wrong way, put this down. Ready? And we'll start. That's my fourth and last addition of butter. And you can hear it too. At this point, it just sounds sticky. One of the lovely things I love about baking is that they're usually indicators that are visual, but sometimes there are audible indicators. So in this case, the visual indicator is that it looks shaggy, it's sticking to the bottom of the bowl, it just looks kind of not so great. On the other hand, I also hear it sounding sticky, so if I'm kind of not getting a visual of my mixing bowl, I can hear that it's not ready either. And then as it starts coming together correctly, it will start going thwap, 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 like a dog's tail whacking against the door when it wants to go outside. So now I'm just going to stop it for a second before I go for the long mix and make sure that it comes down off that hook. And then I will wash my hands. And you can smell the aroma of the almond, of the zest, of the vanilla, and it's just so lovely. You can already get a sense of how delicious this will be once it bakes up. I'm going to stop it now. So now it's started to pull away from the bottom and the sides. It's still going to be a little sticky, but it's no longer sticking to my hands. Look how shiny it is. Elapsed time is 12 minutes since the butter was fully incorporated. It could take longer, it could be shorter, but look at how smooth that is. When it was still working its way around the dough hook, it was collecting everything from the bottom and sides of the bowl. So there was nothing sticking to the bottom anymore, even though it's still a very loose dough. As I pick it up, I can see that there's strength, but it's not tearing. This is also important. So I'm going to cover this now and let it rest for about an hour. And then we'll be able to continue making our Zwetschgendatschi.